because there comes a year, a threshold, a psychological season when the empath stops absorbing everyone's wounds and starts exposing the roots of them. When they stop explaining their pain and start understanding their power. When they realize that compassion without boundaries is self-betrayal disguised as virtue. 2026 is that year. It is the year the empath sees clearly, not softly, not naively, but with a sharp vision that comes from surviving emotional storms most people never recognize. The world praises the empath for being gentle, forgiving, endlessly patient. What they rarely talk about is the empath who finally wakes up, who recognizes the patterns, the manipulation, the guilt loops, the family myths passed down like invisible chains. Because every empath has that moment, the moment when the fog lifts, the moment when the narcissist's charm no longer hypnotizes, the moment when the family's unspoken rules don't upset, don't expose, don't confront, lose their hold. This is not rebellion. This is evolution. The empath who confronts the narcissist does not do it out of anger. They do it out of clarity. Clarity that comes from years of swallowing emotions that were never their own, from absorbing blame that never belonged to them, from carrying the entire emotional weight of a family that refused to grow. 2026 belongs to those who finally put the weight down, because there is a psychological law. The moment you refuse to participate in dysfunction, the dysfunction reveals itself. And the empath, after a lifetime of being the emotional healer, the peacekeeper, the forgiver, finally realizes that healing a family system requires confronting the very wounds everyone is afraid to name. This is the year the empath stops apologizing for their intuition, stops shrinking to protect fragile egos, stops softening truth to maintain harmony. This is the year they confront the narcissist not with rage, but with unwavering boundaries, not with shouting, but with self-respect, not with vengeance, but with awareness that the narcissist's entire identity collapses when no one fuels it, and family pain, generational, unspoken, inherited, begins to unravel. Because every family has a designated empath, the one who feels everything, absorbs everything, and tries to save everyone. But in 2026, that person stops playing the role the family assigned. They rewrite the script, they break the silent contract. They become the first in the lineage to say, the empath's awakening begins when they finally refuse to carry what never belonged to them. It is not a single moment, but a slow, powerful unfolding, a psychological shift that occurs after years of absorbing emotions, conflicts, and responsibilities that were never their burden to hold. For so long, the empath has been conditioned to believe that their worth is measured by how much they can endure, how many wounds they can soothe, how many storms they can stand in the center of without collapsing. They learn early that peace is something they must maintain, even if it costs them their own inner calm. They learn that other people's needs must come first, even when their own heart is asking for rest. They learn to become defined by their ability to feel, to sense, to heal, to understand. But eventually the body weakens, the mind grows tired, and the spirit begins to whisper that something is out of balance. Awakening does not begin with strength. It begins with exhaustion. It begins with the empath finally realizing that their emotional labor has become a form of self-erasure. They look at the weight they've carried, years of guilt, fear, obligation, unspoken expectations, and they begin to ask a question they never dared to ask before. Why am I holding this? This question cracks the surface of the old identity. It reveals that much of what they believed was compassion was actually survival, an attempt to secure love, safety, and belonging by minimizing themselves. They start to recognize that half the emotions they thought were their own were absorbed from others, that the conflicts they tried to solve did not originate from their soul, that the tension they tried to soothe was not theirs to soothe. This recognition is the first spark of awakening, the first moment when the empath begins to stand apart from the emotional chaos around them rather than within it. They begin noticing the patterns, how certain people continuously hand them burdens, how certain family members rely on them for emotional stability, how certain partners, friends, or colleagues use their sensitivity without ever offering reciprocity. They observe how they've been expected to listen but not speak, to forgive but not receive, to understand but never be understood. And for the first time, the empath sees that this imbalance is not kindness, it is self-neglect masquerading as duty. The awakening deepens when they realize that carrying everything does not save anyone. It only drains the one who carries it. They see that healing others at the cost of their own soul is not noble but destructive. They see that people who rely on them to carry emotional loads often do so because they refuse to carry their own. The moment this truth lands, the empath starts to withdraw from old dynamics, not out of anger but out of clarity. They stop volunteering for pain that isn't theirs. They stop absorbing energy that doesn't belong to them. They stop over-explaining, over-apologizing, over-giving. They begin to understand that boundaries are not walls, but filters that separate what is theirs from what is not. They stop being the emotional container for everyone else and start becoming the guardian of their own inner world. They begin to feel their own emotions more clearly because they are no longer buried beneath the weight of others. They begin to speak more honestly because their voice is no longer suffocated by the pressure to keep the peace. They begin to trust their intuition again because it is no longer clouded by the needs of everyone around them. As this inner shift grows, the empath discovers something they never recognized in themselves: inner authority. For the first time, they realize they can exist without shrinking. They can love without losing themselves. They can care without collapsing. They can be compassionate without becoming responsible for every broken piece they encounter. They learn that their sensitivity is a gift only when it is protected, that their heart is powerful only when it is not weighed down by burdens that are not theirs. And with each burden they set down, they feel themselves return to their true nature, not the version shaped by obligation and emotional survival, but the version shaped by authenticity, self-respect, and clarity. This is the empath's awakening, the realization that their life, their energy, their love, and their peace are theirs to protect. And the moment they stop carrying what never belonged to them is the moment they begin to rise into who they were always meant to be. Family pain is inherited, but courage is chosen, and 2026 is the year of choosing differently. This truth begins to surface the moment you realize that the patterns shaping your life are older than you, older than your parents, older than the versions of your family you believe you know. Family pain does not suddenly appear. It travels through generations like an echo, carried in stories, silences, behaviors, and wounds that no one had the tools to heal. It hides in the way people communicate or don't communicate. It shows up in the triggers, the fears, the guilt, the expectations. It appears in the emotional roles assigned without consent: the caretaker, the fixer, the scapegoat, the overachiever, the quiet one, the one who must hold everything together. And because it is familiar, it feels normal, even when it hurts. But at some point, a new kind of awareness awakens in someone within the family line. The recognition that something is not right, that the heaviness they carry is not entirely theirs, that the patterns repeating in their relationships, self-image, and decisions were shaped long before they were born. This realization is the doorway to courage, because confronting family pain is one of the most demanding psychological journeys a person can take. It requires looking at the very people you love and seeing their humanity instead of the idealized versions you once clung to. It requires acknowledging that their wounds shaped yours, that their survival strategies became your inherited fears, that their silence created your confusion, that their patterns are now reflected in your behavior. Yet 2026 stands as a symbolic turning point, a year where collective consciousness around emotional inheritance is rising, where more people are becoming aware of the chains their families carried for decades, where the empathic and intuitive individuals within these systems are finally saying, it ends here. Choosing differently does not mean choosing against your family. It means choosing for yourself in a way no one before you had the strength, knowledge, or freedom to do. The courage of this choice is profound because it requires breaking traditions that were never healthy, questioning beliefs that were never yours, and facing truths that were carefully buried to protect fragile identities. This courage begins with acknowledging what you absorbed without permission. Maybe it was the pressure to be perfect. Maybe it was the responsibility to keep peace between people who refused to go. Maybe it was the guilt that came every time you tried to create distance. Maybe it was the fear that your voice would cause disruption. Maybe it was the belief that love must be earned through sacrifice. These are not traits. They are emotional inheritances, passed down because no one before you could break the cycle. But cycles do not end by themselves. They end when someone finally decides that repeating the past is no longer an option. 2026 becomes the year of choosing differently, because this is the moment when awareness turns into action, when you begin to separate your identity from your family story, when you stop taking responsibility for pain that was never your creation, when you stop carrying secrets that protected others but suffocated you, when you stop accepting roles that demand your silence, when you realize that compassion does not require you to sacrifice your emotional health, when you understand that healing the lineage begins with healing yourself. Choosing differently may look like setting boundaries for the first time, even when your voice shakes. It may look like walking away from family patterns that felt inevitable. It may look like telling the truth about how certain behaviors affected you. It may look like refusing to mirror the emotional avoidance everyone else normalized. It may look like choosing therapy, introspection, or personal development, even if no one understands why. It may look like building a future rooted in emotional safety instead of generational habits. The courage you choose disrupts the entire emotional architecture of the past. The moment you choose differently, the unspoken rules lose power. The moment you break the pattern breaks its hold on you. And even though your ancestors could not name their wounds, your decision to heal becomes the resolution they were never able to reach. You become the turning point in the family line, the one who stands at the intersection of what was and what can be, the one who transforms inherited pain into inherited strength, the one who proves that even if pain is passed down, so is the possibility of transformation. The narcissist loses power the moment the empath sees the manipulation instead of the mask. For years, the empath may have been entranced by the charm, the charisma, the outward perfection that conceals the subtle mechanisms of control. Narcissists are experts at creating illusions, perfect smiles, grand gestures, persuasive words, and carefully curated personas that demand admiration and obedience. They craft realities where their victims feel responsible for maintaining harmony, where the empath believes that love, loyalty, and patience are the currencies that will earn safety and validation. But beneath the mask lies a constant, calculated effort to dominate emotional space, to extract energy, to bend perception, and to keep the empath tethered to a false narrative. The moment the empath begins to recognize this is the moment the illusion begins to crumble. Recognition is a quiet, almost imperceptible process at first. It starts with a feeling that something is off, a tension that does not match the surface-level interactions. The empath begins noticing discrepancies, words that contradict actions, promises that dissolve into excuses, compliments that carry subtle undermining, apologies that repeat patterns instead of healing them. At first, the empath may doubt their own perception, wondering if they are overreacting, misinterpreting, or too sensitive. This is the final test of the empath's awakening, choosing to trust their intuition over the carefully constructed narrative the narcissist imposes. The awareness grows slowly, sometimes painfully, as the empath pieces together the emotional manipulations, the invisible levers of guilt, fear, obligation, and shame. When the empath finally discerns manipulation from authenticity, a radical shift occurs. The narcissist's power relies entirely on invisibility. It is the unrecognized influence that sustains control. If the empath continues to see only the mask, the charm, the words, the gestures, the narcissist remains untouchable. But once the empath sees the mechanism behind the mask, the energy exchange changes. No longer complicit in the unconscious dynamics, the empath ceases to supply the validation and submission the narcissist depends upon. The games of blame, projection, and gaslighting lose their effectiveness because the empath is no longer participating blindly. The power that once seemed untouchable now wavers under the clarity of insight. This shift is not about confrontation at first, nor about proving a point. It is an internal revolution, a quiet but absolute reorganization of awareness. The empath recognizes that the narcissist's admiration, seeking, manipulation, and control are performances, strategies designed to conceal fragility and exert dominance. The empath's recognition is like sunlight hitting shadows. The mask may remain, but its power is diminished because its deception is no longer effective. The empath's emotional autonomy becomes the ground on which they reclaim their life, their decisions, and their energy. Boundaries that were once negotiable now become inviolable. Choices that were once influenced by fear, guilt, or obligation now align with personal truth. The narcissist's illusions cannot survive in this space because they were never rooted in reality to begin with. They thrived only on the empath's unawareness. The empath also discovers a profound psychological liberation in this moment. They no longer feel responsible for the narcissist's moods, reactions, or perceptions. They begin to detach emotionally without disengaging morally or ethically. They learn to respond rather than react, to observe rather than absorb, to protect rather than placate. This detachment is not coldness, it is clarity. It is the understanding that empathy does not require surrender. It is the realization that compassion for others does not mandate subjugation to manipulation. The empath's perception becomes a shield, a lens through which they can navigate relationships without being ensnared by unseen strings. As the empath's awareness deepens, they begin to see the pattern of repeated behaviors that maintain narcissistic control across multiple contexts, family dynamics, romantic relationships, workplaces, or friendships. This recognition allows them to anticipate manipulation, prevent energy drains, and maintain psychological sovereignty. The empath's presence changes the dynamic fundamentally. The narcissist may continue performing, but the audience is no longer compliant, and the performance loses its impact. The empath becomes invisible to the control, while fully visible to their own truth. They no longer provide the validation and emotional supply that the narcissist thrives on. Without the unconscious collusion of the empath, the narcissist's influence fractures, revealing vulnerability, insecurity, and emptiness that were always hidden beneath the mask. Ultimately, this is a moment of transformation for the empath, a turning point where insight replaces confusion, clarity replaces doubt, and strength replaces submission. The narcissist, who once wielded power effortlessly, now faces the empath's conscious awareness, a force it cannot manipulate, charm, or intimidate. It is the beginning of liberation, the reclaiming of personal energy, and the restoration of self-sovereignty. The empath's awakening to the manipulation marks the collapse of illusion and the rise of self-determination, reshaping the emotional landscape and redefining what is possible in relationships, boundaries, and personal growth. Healing is not gentle. It is the confrontation of the shadow that frees an entire lineage. True healing does not arrive in soft whispers or in moments of polite reflection. It arrives in the intensity of facing what has long been denied, buried, or ignored. The shadow is the collection of all that we reject in ourselves, all that our families reject, and all that generations before us have refused to acknowledge. It is the hidden pain, the unspoken trauma, the patterns of silence, control, neglect, and anger that thread through a lineage like an invisible current. To heal, to truly break free from cycles that have defined lives for decades or centuries, we must confront the shadow with courage, honesty, and unwavering presence. This confrontation begins with awareness. It begins when the individual refuses to look away from the parts of themselves and their family that are uncomfortable, shameful, or painful. It begins when they stop explaining away behaviors, justifying dysfunction, or accepting narratives designed to protect appearances rather than truth. The shadow is not something that disappears when ignored. It grows, mutates, and exerts influence silently, shaping choices, emotions, and relationships. The empath, the sensitive individual, or the seeker of truth must recognize that the shadow has been inherited along with family stories, beliefs, and emotional patterns. It is passed down in ways both overt and subtle, in unresolved grief, in fear disguised as caution, in anger unexpressed, in loyalty forced, in love withheld. Healing demands seeing these patterns, naming them, and tracing them back to their origin without the need to cast blame. Confronting the shadow requires courage because it is inherently uncomfortable. It requires sitting with emotions that have been denied for generations. It demands witnessing pain that has been carefully hidden, understanding behaviors that once seemed inexplicable, and feeling the collective weight of family burdens that you never asked for but cannot ignore. The confrontation is not about attacking others or condemning the past. It is about truthfully acknowledging the darkness in order to illuminate it. It is about recognizing that suffering repeated in silence only strengthens its hold. The shadow, once unexamined, dictates relationships, choices, and self-perception. Once faced, it can be integrated and released, allowing patterns that no longer serve the lineage to dissolve. Healing is active, not passive. It manifests in the decisions to break cycles, speak truths, set boundaries, and reclaim emotional autonomy. It manifests in moments of introspection that demand honesty and self-discipline. It manifests in the willingness to sit with discomfort, to endure the feelings of shame, guilt, anger, and sorrow long enough to understand them. It manifests in the courage to confront family dynamics that have kept patterns alive for generations, to challenge roles and expectations that were never fair, and to refuse participation in unconscious repetition of harm. Each act of conscious confrontation, each acknowledgement of the shadow is a seed planted for generational transformation. The liberation that comes from confronting the shadow does not belong to the individual alone. It ripples through the lineage. When one person refuses to carry unacknowledged pain, when one person chooses awareness over avoidance, when one person refuses to repeat the patterns, the energy of the entire family system begins to shift. The unresolved grief of ancestors finds expression and release. The cycles of fear, secrecy, and suppression start to break. The unspoken rules that dictated behavior lose authority. Children, grandchildren, and even distant relatives experience the effects of this awakening, often without knowing its origin. The courage to face the shadow becomes a legacy, a gift of possibility for those who follow. Healing becomes multidimensional, personal, relational, and ancestral all at once. Confronting the shadow also transforms the self. The empath, the seeker, the healer discovers a new depth of strength, compassion, and clarity. They realize that true healing requires witnessing pain without being consumed by it, integrating it without letting it define them, and acknowledging it without passing it forward unconsciously. They come to understand that shadows are not enemies but unrecognized parts of reality, and that liberation comes from engagement rather than avoidance. The confrontation, though arduous, reveals a power that had been obscured by fear, silence, and repetition. The courage to face what is hidden becomes the key to breaking cycles, reclaiming identity, and restoring wholeness. Through this process, the lineage itself transforms. What once was bound by fear, secrecy, and inherited suffering becomes fertile ground for growth, awareness, and conscious love. Healing, therefore, is not a gentle process of comfort. It is a radical act of facing the darkness, speaking the unspoken, and refusing to participate in inherited patterns of pain. It is the decisive confrontation that frees hearts, minds, and spirits from the chains of generations, creating space for resilience, clarity, and conscious choice. 2026 belongs to the empath because they no longer seek approval, they seek inner truth. For years, the empath has been conditioned to measure their worth through the eyes of others, to weigh every action, word, and thought against the expectations and judgments of the world around them. They have lived in a constant state of vigilance, listening for signs of acceptance, watching for signs of rejection, and bending their identity to fit the contours of what others demanded in relationships, in families, in workplaces. They have been guided by the invisible compass of approval rather than the internal compass of self-awareness. They have given their energy, their emotions, and even their sense of self to maintain harmony, to be liked, to be accepted, to be seen as good, kind, or deserving. But the year 2026 marks a profound turning point. The empath begins to understand that approval is a fleeting, unreliable measure of value. The desire to be validated by others, to have every emotion understood, every action praised, every word acknowledged, is ultimately a trap. It is a chain that binds the empath to the perceptions, insecurities, and manipulations of those around them. Seeking approval requires relinquishing sovereignty. It requires bending to the emotional gravity of someone else's world instead of inhabiting one's own. The empath discovers, often through trial, heartache, and reflection, that approval is conditional, external, and often contradictory. No matter how much they give, someone always finds something lacking. Someone always expects more. Someone always imposes a standard that cannot be met. And so the empath begins to look elsewhere for the first time, truly, meaningfully, consciously. Inner truth becomes the new guiding principle. Instead of asking, will they like me, or am I enough for them, the empath begins asking, am I aligned with myself? And does this feel right in my own heart? They start listening to the quiet, persistent voice inside that has always known what is authentic, what resonates, and what sustains their spirit. They begin to measure decisions not by social reward or fear of disapproval, but by the sense of integrity and coherence within themselves. They start prioritizing honesty over pleasing, clarity over compliance, authenticity over affirmation. The inner compass becomes sharper, more reliable, more liberating than any external validation ever could be. This shift is not immediate nor comfortable. The empath must confront the discomfort of uncertainty, the fear of conflict, and the vulnerability of standing apart from expectations. They may feel the pushback of those accustomed to controlling or influencing their behavior, the disappointment of people who thrived on compliance, and the subtle isolation that comes from refusing to conform. Yet every moment of resistance reinforces the empath's commitment to inner truth. The empath learns to navigate relationships and environments with discernment, offering connection without surrender, giving love without losing themselves, and contributing without allowing manipulation. Their actions become deliberate, conscious, and aligned with their own values rather than dictated by external approval. As the empath continues this journey, they experience a profound transformation in self-perception. The self is no longer defined by reflection in the eyes of others. It is self-contained, resilient, and radiant. The empath learns that approval is never the measure of their worth, that the acceptance they seek externally cannot substitute for the validation they generate internally. They discover a freedom that had been elusive, freedom to make choices based on personal integrity, freedom to express emotions without fear of judgment, freedom to love without seeking reciprocity, freedom to set boundaries without guilt. The internal landscape becomes a sanctuary, a source of power, and a foundation for authentic engagement with the world. In this context, 2026 becomes symbolic. It is the year the empath stops negotiating with the expectations of others and begins to negotiate only with the truth within. It is the year the empath ceases to measure life by praise or criticism and starts measuring it by alignment, resonance, and authenticity. It is the year they claim emotional sovereignty, refusing to be manipulated by fear, guilt, or need for approval. The empath's energy, once diffused in attempts to satisfy everyone, is now concentrated, potent, and purposeful. Their presence becomes magnetic, not because it is approved, but because it is genuine. Their choices become unwavering, not because they are accepted, but because they are aligned. Their voice becomes clear, not because it is echoed, but because it is heard within. Seeking inner truth rather than approval also transforms the empath's relationships and interactions. Connections are no longer transactional or performative. They are reciprocal, conscious, and grounded in authenticity. The empath recognizes the difference between genuine resonance and superficial affirmation, and they begin to cultivate environments that support growth, clarity, and mutual respect. They offer guidance, love, and insight from a place of strength, not obligation. They engage with the world not to be liked, but to live fully, honestly, and powerfully, anchored in the certainty of their inner knowing. The empath's awakening is therefore not merely personal, it is transformational, shaping the dynamics of relationships, communities, and the emotional currents they touch.